So Glenn, thanks for coming in today. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to it. So we've done a number of these leadership journey interviews so far and discussions. You're actually the first leader of an Assurex Global partner that we've spoken with. Give me a little picture of that history and the story of what Horton was when you joined in, I think it was 1978, to what it is now.
Well, it started in my parents' bedroom before 1978. They sold insurance out of their bedroom. My dad was a crane operator. They finally moved it out of the house, and in 1978 I got out of college, which I did nothing exceptional in. Didn't have a job, didn't really want to look for one, and I think my dad got fed up with the idea that I wasn't going to be working. So he said, why don't you come to work in the agency? And rather than find a job, I went to work in the agency figuring it would just be temporary. Kind of took a liking to the business. A few years later, we merged with my uncle's agency, who had a small agency with 3 or 4 people, and altogether, I believe we had 8-10 people together. In about 1972, my dad and my uncle had decided that they wanted to sell the agency and retire, so my dad and uncle sold the agency with $340,000 in revenue. I always remember the name or the number because it's just one of those numbers that sticks with you. It was a lot of money at the time.
Yeah.
We bought $340,000 in revenue from my dad and my uncle, we being myself and another guy that had come to work with us, and just kind of went to work. We probably took on obligations that were about 25% more than we could really handle to buy that agency, and didn't really know how we were going to do it, and just had the good fortune about a year and a half after we bought the agency, because we'd have never made it had this luck had not happened. We wrote an account, pure luck, that's a story in and of itself, with about $700,000 or $800,000 in revenue. That put that on top of a $340,000 revenue agency.
You've got something.
You covered no more overhead. You covered things pretty well. So that really was the luck that enabled us to do the old-fashioned things of starting to hire producers and starting to develop a little more capability in the agency. Didn't do any acquisitions, but hired some pretty good, what turned out to be ultimately the future principals, owners of the agency during that period of time. Towards the end of the 90s, towards the end of the 80s, we expanded into the benefits business and hired a couple of really good benefits guys. And by 95-ish, we had built it up to about $5 million in revenue, just pure organic and expansion. In 95, we were still growing pretty quickly, but just felt we weren't growing fast enough, for what we wanted. And somebody convinced us that we should start trying to do some acquisitions. That was really before anybody did acquisitions, but we started to do some acquisitions. Had to go out and get a line of credit. At that point, we had about $75,000 in profit in EBITDA. So getting a line of credit and all that wasn't that easy of a deal, but we managed to put it together. I think our first credit facility was about $300,000,
sure.
Which we levered up to buy some agencies and such. We bought an agency which was about $1.5 million in revenue, was really our first decent sized acquisition. And so fast forward between 2005 and about 2005, primarily through acquisitions, but sort of a continuing organic growth. We'd gone from about $5 million in revenue till probably about $30 million in revenue.
So in that 10-year period, from 5,000
to 30.
Wow.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I have the numbers exactly right, but it's pretty close.
Yeah.
And then from 2005 until today, we've continued to do an occasional acquisition, but probably 2/3 of our growth to now about $80 million in revenue has been back into organic growth, back in through producer development, mostly internal driven growth, with every year and a half, maybe an acquisition, but given mostly the marketplace change in terms of the competition with private equity and public brokers and the
Sure.
valuations, which seem preposterous to me in terms of what a privately held agency can do and should do in terms of the cost of capital, we've just found it to be a much better return through organic growth. And so about a year and a half ago, I passed the CEO reins on to my son, Dan, and I'm now the chairman, and really not a very active chair. I mean, I'm not an executive chairman who comes in every day and has a real role. I continue to own a substantial part of the stock of the agency, but really don't have much of a role. And him, as well as the team that, to some degree I put together and some degree he's put together since, is doing a good job of taking it now to the next level.
So what's the revenue picture today?
About $80 million
80
in
million.
revenue. Yeah.
So from 340 to 80, that's
Right.
not a bad run. It's pretty good.
Best I could do.
So how long were you the president and CEO? What did that picture look like?
So I was the president and CEO for whatever that was worth from the time we bought it from my dad and uncle in 82-ish
82.
until I passed it along about a year and a half ago.
That's great. That's incredible performance. So coming out of college, you toyed with going to law school.
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit. Decided to stay in the agency instead. Where did you kind of develop your own leadership style, leadership approach, leadership philosophy? Where did that come from?
And I think it was probably more accidental than intentional, but I would say very early on, I developed an understanding that running the business was different than writing insurance business. And so I realized if the agency was going to grow, I would have to focus more on running the business, that we could hire lots of people to sell insurance and service insurance and things like that. And so the logical extension of that is that you have to develop some leadership skills, and there are lots of resources to develop leadership skills out there. And so I just became pretty intentional about trying to get information, to join organizations, and to get exposure to people that could improve my skills in management and or leadership.
So Glenn, you start thinking about the leadership role, and as you're jumping into that, did you go to graduate school for an MBA? Did you start learning on your own? What did that process look like as you're really jumping into a leadership role?
Well, I didn't go to graduate school. I didn't even get my bachelor's degree till I was 57, but that's a whole nother story. I did realize though early on, and I think this was really important to what we did at the agency, was that there was a difference between running the company and writing a book of business or writing insurance or doing insurance. And that if we were going to go somewhere with the company, that we needed to have somebody that was focused on the company and somebody that was focused on insurance. And so my role was going to be focused on the company. And so I realized as an extension of that, of course, that leadership and leadership development management was an important part of that, and I didn't have any background or skill or training in that, so I figured I better get to work. And so I did consume a lot of information, reading and seminars and different things that were available. Fortunately, there was tons of it available, starting with Edward Deming and Total Quality Management which was a big thing in the 80s. Yeah. And then General Electric and Jack Welch was the big thing in the 90s. And there's always a fad or a current state of management development that's out there, and I've always tried to follow those along and learn from those. I was fortunate to surround myself with some people that were very good mentors and things like that. A lot of that came through an organization that's now called Vistage, but used to be called Tech. And there's similar organizations to that. But essentially it's a group of business people, about a dozen business people that are in a group, get together about once a month, have different speakers on different management topics, leadership topics, and through that group continued to learn more. And ultimately we had our own board of directors, developed our own board of directors, and just continued to do those things.
And you've always had, I shouldn't say that, you have an external board of directors, right?
Correct, right.
And how long has that existed?
Since '95.
Okay, so early on you started having external.
Right.
Okay, right. Interesting. I want to go back to, so you buy the agency in 1982. You're 340 of revenue. You start growing the agency. At what point did you start thinking, I need to be a leader in the business and not just build my own book of business?
Very, very early on.
Okay.
There's a book that was written back then that I still remember. It's kind of a classic called The E-Myth. And the principle of the E-Myth is essentially that just because you're good at something like insurance doesn't mean you're good at something like business. And you better get good at business if you're going to be good, if the business is going to be good.
Yeah.
And so I remember reading that very early on, and that put that idea into my head. So obviously that's a stress on a company with $340,000 in revenues that's already 25% over its skis in terms of paying the bills. But as I said, we wrote that account that had $700,000 or $800,000 in revenue or whatever it was, and that allowed us to make a lot of mistakes and hire some people that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to hire, and enabled me to focus on that part of the business for a period of time until we could get some traction and
Sure.
hire people that could really write business and things like that. And it isn't that I didn't write any business. I always had a book of business, but not necessarily,
Sure.
commensurate with what it would take to cover the overhead of the management team.
Yeah. So, and then again, developing your own leadership skill set and then building a team,
right,
is again a skill set that's completely different. What was the time frame of that, and what did that look like?
You go through phases, and I think you pretty early begin to realize that the art of leadership and management and the success of the business is going to be built around what you can do to get other people, develop other people, and build other people. I mean, it's kind of one of the keys to leadership, right?
Absolutely.
You're not a leader if you don't have any followers, and so you better have some good followers. And so like us all, we made a million mistakes in terms of the people we hired, the way we handled them, whether they were good, bad, or
Sure.
So that, but clearly, just like probably earlier than most companies, where we made the decision to take somebody out of production to run the business, I would say we've always sort of been ahead of our peer group in terms of, at whatever size we were or are, in terms of trying to hire. We've had a great chief financial officer since we were $30 million in revenue. That's usually not a size that you would see a really top chief financial officer.
Sure.
We've got a really great HR person, and we've had that for some time. That's typically something that doesn't come until a much larger size.
Sure. So again, I don't mean to keep taking you back too, but let's go back again. So early on, you start developing this knowledge that, okay, I'm going to need to develop leadership skill sets and leadership abilities to really take the organization where you want to go. What were some of the things that resonated with you from a philosophical standpoint? What were some of the things that started to say, okay, that's meaningful to me? Whether it's traits about how you develop a sales force, to how you want your colleagues to experience their job. What started to resonate with you early as leadership philosophies?
I think probably more than anything else was just the reality that it wasn't about sort of the things you did and the tactical decisions you make, that it was almost like an athlete that had to go through training, and that if I didn't make my brain better in terms of being able to, whether it would be listen better or whether it would be better understanding of financial information, or probably even more than anything else, just that notion of vulnerability. There's a tendency, I've found in a lot of leaders of business or CEOs or especially entrepreneurs, maybe less so in paid professional managers, but in a lot of entrepreneurs, there's an ego and a strength and a power thing that goes on that can be very powerful and very effective and very important to the development of a business. I mean, I know some very successful people that you couldn't tell them the sky is blue, when it was blue.
Yeah.
That being said, for me, I thought it was more important to be able to be self-aware, to be vulnerable, to be just willing to change and improve. I didn't think I was that good, so I figured to get better at it, you've got to be willing to take things in and learn, and I think that is sort of developed as a strength, or did develop as a strength that helped me in a lot of situations that I see where, when I watch other people now, I can say, God, if I could get some vulnerability in them, they would be able to do a lot better. But it's unfortunately often a difficult jump to make for that particular type of personality. So there was that whole thing around my personality and my strengths and my weaknesses, and acknowledging them or capitalizing on them that I got help with. We already talked about the importance of other help, other input from other people, whether that be the board of directors, the basic skills from finance to planning, to all those kinds of things that came along, and then I guess just, if it is in a separate category, just that people development, that need to always try to get other people in that were better at, always be willing to take that. Somebody once told one of my favorite lines that somebody once ever said was, "You got to give up power to get it," and there's nothing ever more true. You've got to give up power, which makes you feel sometimes sort of not empowered or not in control.
Yeah.
But that's what really gives you the strength and the power, and so that always just resonated with me, and despite the many mistakes I made in bringing in those other people to power, there was enough successes that they were instrumental in building the business.
So when you think about how that sort of ethos exists in Horton today, do you think that permeates quite a bit? Do you think the organization itself has taken on a great deal of your approach and your philosophy?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on who you ask. If you ask somebody who's not empowered or doesn't feel empowered or doesn't feel involved, but I can tell you, the organization, certainly in terms of Dan, in terms of the way we do things, we spend an awful lot of time and energy going out trying to get other people's input, trying to get other people's involvement, engagement, all that sort of thing. And I know we're not always successful at that, but God, for the amount of energy we put into it, we must get it right sometime. And so I don't get the sense that not just Dan, but the whole leadership team. I think there's a lot of humility there. There's a lot of vulnerability there. There's a lot of willingness to learn and to move on. And I think that's important.
So just for context, Horton was, I believe, voted the best agency to work for a number of times now. So clearly that message does get through and it is working with people.
Yeah, we have won that award before, depending, so many people that put it on now. It's not an award that we chase after a lot and put a lot of effort into, simply because
you just win it.
To me, it always felt like patting yourself on the back,
Sure.
And especially because I know a lot of companies that do that work it pretty hard. It's like the car dealer that says, "Well, make sure you put the 5 down here on the survey when they call you." I just felt like that's the case. But we do have internal engagement surveys that we use,
Sure.
that we pay somebody to come in and do, and so we get good marks there in a general sense.
Yeah.
And so that's how we approach that more.
Well, and I appreciate it too that there is a sense of mistakes get made and that sort of thing. Because I know when Dan calls me, he generally prefaces it with, "Dean, I know you've made several mistakes in this area." So,
Yeah.
yeah. So I appreciate that. So when you start thinking, Glenn, about the transition into your role as a leader, and now you're kind of at the other end of it where you're starting to transition out, and I think you're more active than you say, but
Well, Dan would probably say I'm more of a pain in the ass than I say, but
but you're starting to be on the other end of it, right? So what's kind of that lasting leadership approach that you want in the organization? What's kind of that lasting impact that you've had?
To try to teach those values to the people in the company, the values of working together, the values of humility, the values of vulnerability, the values of being willing to reinvest in the company, to not just harvest, but to really try to leave a legacy and a structure of values and business practices that can survive a long time or survive through a lot of different environments. I think that's important. And so sometimes that's more just coaching some producer up in terms of what his personal life's going to look like if he doesn't change his act. And he might be a great producer, but you're headed for the fire if you don't. And that's a tough road a lot of times. And
So I want to jump to a different topic for a few minutes. Let's talk about mentors. I find it interesting. So when we joined AssureX, when I was with Amon and we joined AssureX, we actually competed against one another occasionally, and yet you were willing to be a bit of a mentor for me early on, and we came down and visited the agency a few different times. Mm-hmm. Who were mentors for you in your career, and what did that relationship look like?
I would say generally the people that, in a business sense, generally the board people were important mentors to me. That's why they were on the board.
Sure.
I would say one of my biggest mentors has been a guy named Michael Alasso. He's a coach, basically a communications coach, but he's so much more than a communication coach. He's really been a great mentor to me in terms of how to relate to other people, how to talk to other people, how to get points across and things like that. So people that are more in the behavioral, emotional intelligence arena, and some of those resources come through Vistage. That was a source of a lot of those kind of things. But I would see things at AssureX meetings, a speaker that would, I got to get with that person, and that sort of thing.
So tell me.
I wouldn't say that I have one or two, just above all other mentors that I would think of in that context.
I often think about mentors as not a singular, but as a plural. There's, for different parts of my life, I need mentors
for sure.
for different
or
things.
Different situations more than
Absolutely.
More than anything,
Yeah. So tell me about Michael, and I've met him a couple of times. Really interesting individual, and obviously very impactful. Tell me about how he's coached and what that's looked like for you.
Well, he officially, he sells himself as a communications coach. But in order to understand how people are receiving communication or how people are delivering it, you kind of got to understand what's going on in their head. And he's actually professionally, he's a drama teacher. He's a drama director, drama teacher.
Sure.
And I learned through my experience with him that in order to be a director or a drama teacher, I mean, let's face it, actors are basically acting out roles that are different than what they really are. So you really better understand how the real person is delivering it and what's impactful and what's not. And so Michael's just developed a practice where he's just extremely skilled at not just learning how you communicate, but looking inside your head to figure out what's really going on. And once he figures what's really going on, then he understands why the communication is the way it is. And sometimes in order to alter the way the communication is, you have to alter what's going on inside the head.
Sure.
If I think I'm being kind and I'm really being angry, because that's the emotion I feel, and I don't sometimes even realize it, Michael's got such a high skill level, he can make me understand, no, this trigger's making you feel anger rather than, that other emotion. and it's just really an extraordinary skill that has helped me tremendously, I think, and helped lots of people in our company.
So for essentially 40 years, you've been a significant leader in this business. For how much of that time have you actually also been a student?
You mean you mean the technical part of the business, or
from trying to develop yourself and grow who you are? And
I don't think that ever stops. I mean, I'm probably devoting more time to it now that I'm out of the business, because now I finally have the time to explore some other things that I'm interested in. I've never been able to. I've always been interested in passive investing, and I've never been good at it, and I've never had the time or the interest to study it. But now I'm really fascinated by it and interested in it, or politics, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So that's.
So it never stops.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Not for me. I would imagine for most people it never stops. For some, it never starts.
Yeah, and I think there's probably a pretty strong direct correlation between that self-improvement and that development of skill set when it starts, and there's probably a line toward success, and maybe when it never starts, then it probably not so much. When you think about the philosophies you've had and carried through the organization for 40 years, are there things that have changed pretty dramatically in that time frame, just from a philosophical standpoint, or kind of the capstone type approach to things?
Well,
has the bedrock stayed the same?
Yeah, I think the basic, if you were to go back 40 years or whatever it's been, and sit down with the people that were there then and the people that are there now, I think there's a lot of similarity of personality and values and things like that. Now, the people today are way more skilled and way better in 100 different ways, but I think I think that's what I meant by, not only is it similar to what it was 40 years ago, it's there's certain values that hopefully will be around 40 years from now. Now at the same time, it's important, I think, to recognize that a lot of things, it's more about the things that probably change than the things that, I'm a big student of generational differences. And so, we have essentially, when I started, a baby boom generation and baby boom values and baby boom outlook. And today we have essentially millennials and a millennial outlook and a millennial values, and they're very different. And in a good way, I think it's important that they be different and adapt. I see a lot of companies that still have baby boom values, and I don't think they're headed in the right direction. So I would say they're both different and similar, and hopefully we got enough of those right in each category.
Yeah, and yet it's still a challenge both to transition personally as well as have a business transition through those time periods, and I always find that interesting. So when you think of the leadership team that you aspired to develop back in the day and the leadership team that exists at Horton today, are there a lot of similarities in what you aspired it to be, or does it look different than you thought it would?
Well, I guess it is what I aspired it to be, and that they're real professionals in their areas of expertise that have been brought in generally with greater existing experience from another organization than what we would ever give them. When you first start out, you kind of bring people up through the organization, and so it's the old Peter principle. They know at most what they learned from your organization, and that's where you bring people from mostly. Now, generally, when we bring people in, we're bringing someone in who's been in a much bigger organization or a more complex organization or a different organization where they developed a different skill. So our chief financial officer, our first great one, never had any skill or never had any experience in the insurance business, but boy, he was one hell of a chief financial officer that taught us so much. So it's just a level of skill and experience and intelligence that, God, we just never would have been able to bring up back in the old days. I didn't have it, and the people I started with didn't have it.
I think, Glenn, there's something to that concept of sometimes you can have somebody that has 1 year of experience 20 years in a row versus somebody that has 20 years of experience.
Yeah, that is really true. Yeah.
There's a distinction there. And yet bringing someone in from the outside into a leadership role is filled with all kinds of pitfalls as well. So how are you able to develop that as a competency for your organization?
Well, I'm a big believer in leadership development internally versus outside. I always view it as kind of a failure when you have to go outside, with the exception of some of the key positions like CFO, like Chief Human Resources Officer. Those would be the two big ones. We just hired a Chief Growth Officer from the outside, but inside the business. This is not a person that came from a different industry.
Sure.
So outside of a few important skill positions, I would say generally I'd be an advocate of bringing them in from the inside, and I think the probability of success is statistically proven to be much greater when you bring somebody in from the inside. It's just that then you're going to run the risk of just what I talked about.
Absolutely.
The skill set that it's no different than when Dan took over as CEO. I said, we need to get Dan a different set of mentors and a different set of influencers, because he can only learn from me what I learned going up to 75 million. I don't know how to run a $150 million agency, and that's what he's got to learn to run. And so he's not going to get that from me. So it doesn't necessarily have to be employees, though, I don't think. I think, Dan's got a whole set of different mentors that are outside the business and some inside.
Is that the goal? 150? Is that the new goal?
No, I don't think we've ever been too focused on, a financial or a revenue goal as sort of the target. I think our goals tend to be more around things like specialization or things like something we're trying to do with the culture. Certainly you always want to see yourself doubling every 7 or 8 years or something like that in terms of size. If you're stagnating in terms of revenue, that's obviously not a good sign.
Sure.
If your new business is good, then that's a good sign. But we certainly don't have it's not. I wouldn't even consider it almost a major sharp goal in terms of where we're going to be in terms of revenue in 5 years. Maybe it should be. I'm sure some would say that that's a mistake. But
well, I'm still going to give Dan a hard time.
That'll be Dan's problem now.
Exactly. Hey, one more question, and then we'll turn it to the viewers or our folks dialed in today. You've had a perspective of abundance as long as I've known you. Again, we competed, and yet you invited me into your agency and were willing to share and teach and have been incredibly welcoming. Where did that come from, that attitude of hey, I want to help everybody get better, and I want to share with everybody?
Well, I don't really want to help everybody. I don't know. I just always felt like you learn as much as you give as much as you get in those situations, or you get as much as you give in those situations. And I always had that experience with you, probably more that I got from you. Selfishly, at the time, we were doing a lot of acquisitions, and so part of prospecting for acquisitions was to get to know smaller agencies. And so, part of doing that was maybe the easiest way to get to know them. It's just like you offer a insurance prospect some advice on their insurance when you don't write it, just because that endears them to you, and that was successful a few times. So there was that reason for it. But like I say, somebody once taught me. I was in that group, that Vistage group, and I had been in there for 15 years, and it was getting kind of stale, and I didn't feel like I was learning that much from it, and I was ready to quit. And somebody said to me, "You shouldn't quit. You should just change your sort of outlook, because up to that point, your outlook has been completely, I got to get something from it. I got to show up." And I've got to learn something, and if I'm not learning something today, I didn't get my money's worth, and I didn't get my time's worth. And they made me understand that if you changed your view to come there with the attitude that you're going to try to help somebody else and
Sure.
learn something through that process. Because let's face it, in leadership development, you're constantly trying to help people learn other skills. So by in the Vistage group, working on, okay, that person's got this problem with this HR situation or this financial situation. If I can listen and get involved in that and help them come up with a solution, then you sharpen your own skill set about doing, and then that's a new thing, and it's interesting, and it helps you learn what's probably the highest level skill for a leader in a bigger company, which is trying to develop other people, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Hey, Glenn, thanks so much. I always enjoy visiting with you. It's always enjoyable. It's always informative. I always learn a lot visiting
Likewise.
with you.
Thank you.
Today's been wonderful, really insightful. I think a lot of good things that leaders can take away and learn from and apply to their own lives. So appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.